Jackie, by the way? Jackie?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So, sorry, I want to make sure that, well, we're very pleased to have Raul Gallegos joining us from Caracas, Venezuela today to share his insights. And Raul is a long, he's been covering Venezuela for a long time. He's based in Bogota, Colombia now, as I mentioned, but for many years he was working as a journalist for Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones based in Caracas. He's also worked for the Economist Intelligence Unit and also with Reuters, but now he's a analyst at the company Control Risks. In fact, Raul was the senior analyst for the Andean region, as I mentioned, based in Bogota, Colombia. So for those of you who have not joined us before, I just want to quickly walk through the way we run the webinar. So we'll do a brief introduction, and then we'll have a featured presentation that Raul will manage, and he'll deliver some slides. And then we'll move to a Q&A session immediately following Raul's main presentation. For the Q&A session, just so you know, what we have here is a chat function that I think some of you have already noticed and been using. That's where we will manage the question and answer part of the webinar today. So type your question there for Raul, and we'll get it to him. He'll be able to see that there, and I will be able to read them out as we get them. Don't hesitate. You can post those comments, questions, whatever the case may be, in that chat function during the course of the formal presentation. But you know, I think Venezuela is a topic where I'm not sure if 1 hour will give sufficient due to what's going on in Venezuela. Fortunately, Raul is somebody who can synthesize a lot of complex issues into an amazing, just small number of slides. Obviously, there's huge political discussions that we're going to get into. The focus of the webinar will be on the oil sector and the future of the energy sector. As a matter of fact, the title of this, and I'll give you a plug, Raul, here, the title of this webinar is Crude Nation, Venezuela's Oil Outlook, which is a direct ripoff of the book Raul published late last year called Crude Nation, How Oil Riches Ruined Venezuela. So hopefully we won't be talking about the complete ruin of Venezuela, but rather just some of the outlook and some of the political and economic situations that are driving what is the world's largest holder of natural resources, oil and gas reserves, depending on your estimates, but by most accounts, the #1 holder of international oil and gas reserves in Venezuela, and of course a founding member of the OPEC cartel. And so long an outsized role in global geopolitics when it comes to oil and gas, not just in our hemisphere, but across the world. So I don't want to take any more time from Raul, so I'm going to turn it over to Raul to walk us through his presentation and share his insights. And like I said, we'll get to the question and answer session after the formal presentation. So Raul Gallegos, thanks so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Can you hear me right? Is this
Yep,
is this
perfect.
a good tone of voice?
Sounds good.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for joining us. Basically, the presentation is going to focus on two major areas of our expertise here at OS in the Andean region, and that is both the political front in Venezuela and also a unique window we happen to have into the private sector. The challenges and the opportunities various players in the private sector see in Venezuela. In this particular case, obviously, we're going to be focusing on what players in private are seeing in the oil business particularly. We spend here at Control Risks more than half our time actually consulting with companies on the ground, helping them resolve problem-solve issues with various stakeholders, be it unions, be it local governments, communities, etc. So that consistent contact with the private sector gives us a unique sense of how things are playing out. So without much ado, divided this presentation into 3 quick steps. One, country overview, both political and economic, that will lead us into our scenarios. And of course then the actual meat of the presentation, which is what are we seeing in the oil sector and what are we likely to see there over the next couple of years. Finally, wrapping up with some conclusions. So, without further ado, if we jump into the politics, I think what we will see this year, next year, is a government that moves from a regime that used to at least respect the forms of democracy to one that is quickly stepping over the line of becoming a dictatorship. Why do we say that? Well, we have seen a Maduro administration, the administration of President Maduro, that has scrapped a referendum organized by the opposition without as much as an excuse. We have seen their delay of gubernatorial elections that were due in December of last year, and we still haven't seen any indication by the electoral council of what the electoral timetable will be, which suggests that they continue to delay them. And it would not be surprising to us if by the end of 2018, and oil prices haven't recovered enough for Chavismo to recover its popularity, then we would see obviously delays of the actual presidential elections due in late 2018. Now, how will this happen? Well, we have seen, and we will continue to see, a Maduro administration that will try to disqualify opposition leaders from running for office, so that if elections are held, Chavismo wins most of them, or continues to exert control over most institutions. And when that doesn't work, we will see a Chavismo that will throw opposition members in jail. All of this with the help of a Supreme Court that is allied with Chavismo, and that will continue to nullify everything and anything that comes out of an opposition to Congress, and a military that is, and as it has been over the last 100 years, the backbone of any government in Venezuela. In our view, the military will continue to support Chavismo and will do what it can to make sure that protests don't become uncontrollable social upheaval. If we step into the economic front, we're seeing as obviously an economy in free fall. This is an import-dependent country that has seen imports drop by half just last year. This is a country that has seen inflation of over 450% based on estimates from Oxford Economics, our partner firm. And all of this obviously in a climate of low oil prices. A barrel of oil managed at $40 last year on average. So that means that this year we do expect a contraction of roughly percent. And obviously, the tricky part is that we are seeing a government that, despite this implosion, has no intention of getting rid of the capital and price controls and runaway spending that have essentially crippled the economy. Some of these controls are directly responsible for stifling industrial production. And as you know, low oil prices mean low revenues, and this will also mean this year that the government will continue to restrict foreign currency for production, and that will naturally lead to a return of shortages of food and other goods. This week, we already saw a government that is going after bakeries. Right. So what does this mean, and where are we headed? I think before we answer that question, it's important to look at this slide, which gives us a sense of what type of raw material, as far as political class, are we dealing with here. We're dealing with, you see the Chavistas on the upper right-hand quadrant there. This quadrant divides, politicians between their allegiance to democratic principles and whether they believe in free market versus state control. And what we're seeing is a very radical government where most of their laws are very much in line with the of violate basic democratic principles and making sure that the government controls the economy. And those that run the government, which are the more radical wing, are very much in line with that idea. Now, sadly, the opposition, which is on the opposite side of the spectrum, one of them, Lopez, is obviously jailed, but everyone in the opposition, for the most part, sell them as moderate socialists, because this is a country where if you openly express the belief in markets, free enterprise, that can cost you your political career. So the big question is, if new leadership will emerge over the next couple of years, where in that quadrant where in this chart will we find them? And, quite frankly, the answer is not encouraging. Now, what does this mean as far as scenarios? Our more likely scenario is that Maduro will remain in power in 2017 and likely also finish his term in late 2018. Of course, provided that this government doesn't immediately start delaying elections and steps above a crime to become a dictatorship. The most benevolent alternative scenario is that Chavismo and the military at some point might ask Maduro to leave and replace him with another like-minded politician in order to offer the appearance of change, if you will. Still, we find that unlikely because it seems like Maduro has been savvier than a lot of people thought he would be, and taken steps to make sure he surrounds himself with allies so he can stay power. The only potential regime change scenario we have is one where the military turns on Maduro and on Chavismo of uncontrollable sorts of people. The military loses control of parts of the country because that is the only situation where we see the military turning on Chavismo and saying, "Call for elections, I can." That, however, we see as unlikely. And the even more unlikely regime change scenario is a coup. Venezuela, any non-change of government has always involved the passive or active participation of the military. And in this case, the strong alliance between Chavismo and the military suggests that's unlikely. The worst case scenario we conceive of something like what happened in 1992 when President Chavez led a failed coup with a rogue unit within the military that didn't have support of the top echelons in military structure. So that leads us to the oil sector. And what is this whole atmosphere mean for the oil sector? Well, surprisingly, the oil sector is the sector where we're seeing a lot of opportunity. But before we jump to that, I think it's important to note that politics in this country and oil are very, very much intertwined. Obviously, over the last year, the big headline in Venezuela has been the dramatic decline in oil production, particularly because Venezuela has fallen behind in paying its bills to oil services companies that keep oil flowing and to providers of light crude and naphtha, which the government uses to fund with export. So what the last year we've seen a decline of, say, anywhere between 300 and 370,000 barrels a day. If our calculations are correct, along with which we came from economics, assuming the direct communication between the government of Venezuela and OPEC, assuming those figures are correct, the expectation by Oxford is that we would see a 2.15 million barrels a day by the end of the year. Now, that said, what we are seeing, and the big headline out of the last couple of years has been obviously the flexibility, or if you will, the pragmatism and desperation that the government and that PDVSA, the state oil company, have shown under a scenario of low oil prices. And in that sense, we are seeing that the president of PDVSA, Eulogio del Pino, who is a guy who has been in it for a very long time and understands how this works, has tried to create a more favorable climate for oil companies to actually invest fresh cash in the business. We believe that Chavismo will show enough flexibility and pragmatism to leave PDVSA in the hands of people that actually know what they're doing. That said, they will be quite hamstrung to actually implement needed measures quickly, or quickly enough for a number of partners to do what they would like to do in the sector. That said, that has and will continue to mean more operational control for a number of private sector players whenever it is actually doing what they do to oil. That said, that doesn't mean, and we haven't seen any indication as of yet, of the government having any plans to become more flexible in fiscal terms or in royalty terms for the oil industry. Still, it's an indication of how oil and politics is intertwined in here. The fact that the government has used the oil sector to reward or to different constituencies within Chavismo, including the military. The military has created a new oil services military company. A lot of people have been asking that. However, obviously, this company has no experience in actually doing what you do as an oil service company, but it seems as though they will find a way to subcontract that aspect of it, and they might have an opportunity to develop fields along the Venezuela-Colombia border. And obviously, the military will continue to have a role in protect a number of oil ventures along the Orinoco Oil Belt. Now, what does the scenario mean for IOCs? Well, it means better terms and improving terms of business over the next couple of years, assuming that oil prices remain depressed. Obviously, I can't stress enough, all of you know this, how important it is for a number of oil companies to have their foot in what is essentially the biggest oil patch on the planet. Especially now that over the last couple of years, the government has been creating structures with trust fund mechanisms so that any fresh cash that gets invested by a partner is kept away from the hands of politicians who would otherwise use that money to buy refrigerators ahead of an election for potential voters. Now, this does mean that there is a very high likelihood, obviously we're already seeing that the government will start offering higher stakes in oil ventures to potential partners in exchange for cash. In most of the oil ventures in Venezuela, the government has a 60% stake, and the law in Venezuela says that the government only needs to have 50,1%, essentially control, which means that Venezuela has some margin to play with, I don't know, a 9% or so in order to get cash so it could continue to pay its obligations with bondholders and others. This is obviously an opportunity. This opportunity has so far been offered only to Rosneft, which increased its stake in the Orinoco oil venture last year, about a year. And if you've been keeping your eye on the news, you will know that yesterday it emerged that PDVSA apparently is offering a 10% stake in another venture, the Rosneft venture, where PDVSA is a partner with Chevron. We're not sure yet if that is serious or if it's a trial balloon by Venezuela to try and coax Chevron to actually buy in and increase its own stake. We don't know what stage of negotiations or what's going on behind the scenes, but it does suggest that certainly the idea of selling stakes in these ventures to stay afloat financially is certainly an ongoing issue. Now, what are the challenges? Well, you need deep pockets and financing to play. PDVSA doesn't have the money to invest in the oil sector. Come to mention it, PDVSA, even when they had the money, they were not investing enough in the oil sector. So what we have is that PDVSA is coming to partners and saying, I can't front my side of this business, please help me out. The other issue for many operators is the issue of expensive operating expenses. Venezuela, has capital controls, very realistically low exchange rates that it imposes on oil whenever they have to exchange the dollars to pay for salaries and other operating expenses. This has been an ongoing discussion with the government over the last couple of years, and apparently the government has agreed to allow companies or give companies a better exchange rate in exchange for actually fresh cash being invested in the business. Now, the big issue here, the big elephant in the room, and I'm sure a lot of you are going to ask me about this, is the issue of what are the future legal and political implications for any new deals that are struck with the government right now when they're ignoring Congress, and as you know, Congress has to approve some of these deals for them to be legal. That is obviously a very good question. Right now, what we have seen is Congress raised its hand and said, well, you know what, that deal with Rosneft last year might not be legal. We've talked to a number of lawyers on the ground, oil lawyers, and apparently there is a good legal leg to stand on to argue that, Rosneft was already an established partner. This was a joint venture that already existed. So, And if historical precedent is any indication, when Chavismo complained about the legality of a number of oil ventures before they came to power, what they did in the end was change the law and force partners to adopt new agreements. Those who didn't agree obviously left. But at no point did this government say, this is completely legal, you leave, I don't want to do business with you. So a number of players might consider this as an opportunity to get their foot in the door and fix any potential issues later on. What does this mean for oil services companies? Well, right now, the big headline there is that Venezuela, for the first time, is actually thinking of paying oil services companies in oil. As you know, a number of oil services companies have huge debts in Venezuela. They haven't been able to pay for services, and this has actually, accumulated. And that here towards the end of the year, Venezuela actually launched a $3.2 billion bid for additional, and that was the promise. And supposedly this year we are going to see those contracts actually get signed. Now, oil services companies, the good news is also that they're getting more freedom to operate. In the past, they depended on PDVSA to deal with relationships with communities, with relationships with oil unions, and to deal with the security front of their operations. And now they are being given more freedom to run things the way that they see fit in order to keep producing more oil, which is a good thing. Obviously, this is in large part due to the decline in oil prices and the desperation of the Venezuelan government. Also, another plus is we see a low probability of asset seizures. Obviously, Venezuela right now is very much in the mode of increasing oil production. It's very unlikely that we will see the type of asset seizures of oil services companies that we saw, say, 5-6 years ago. And of course, we do expect more drilling rounds like the ones we saw last year happening over the next couple of years as Venezuela tries to ramp up production. Again, we have challenges, and that happens to also be, one of them happens to be the financing. Venezuela has been asking these companies to actually front cash because Venezuela, PDVSA in particular, it continues to be run in a way that its cash is used to pay for debts and pay for social programs. That is tricky because I can tell you I've spoken to a number of clients about this, and they tell me and imagine how tricky it is to go to a bank and say, by the way, can I borrow money because I want to help the leftist anti-capitalist government of Venezuela start drilling for oil. That just doesn't sell that well. And obviously the other issue is that new oil payments, while good news, might take slightly longer than one would expect. The IOCs that have managed to negotiate with PDVSA the opportunity to create these trust fund mechanisms, it took them, more or less 2 years to actually get those online. So this new oil payment, these new oil payment terms, hopefully will actually come to fruition as soon as many expect, but it might take a little bit longer. And of course, the other issue is organized crime. Organized crime keeps stealing equipment and holding up engineers and other workers in oil projects, and that obviously creates unexpected delays and radicalized oil unions that are very much aligned with the government in Venezuela. So, wrap as far as above ground risks. Well, I mean, these are some of the ones we mentioned. Payment, the need for financing. But I would say one of the bigger ones is obviously you have to deal with PDVSA. This is a stodgy institution. This is a very, and that lacks transparency. It's very politicized, and certainly there are issues also of corruption. The good thing is that you have manageable barriers to entry. Why? Well, PDVSA has racked up debts with a number of oil services companies, and it has shown no problem with doing business with new companies and essentially racking up debts with companies. So if you have, again, the tolerance for non-payment for a while, if you have deep pockets and you have that tolerance for risk, Certainly, this is an opportunity to do business in Venezuela. Now, you have to be mindful, of course, that there are reputational risks. As I said, Venezuela is non-transparent. It's an institution that has run across a number of scandals over the last couple of years, not to mention, in some case, assigning drilling contracts to companies that apparently have no experience in drilling. Fortunately, last year, a number of oil services companies raised their hand and said, wait, hold on, you're giving this to whom? It turned out to be a company that had no experience, and PDVSA, to their credit, to some extent, backtracked and actually did that whole process. And of course, finally, again, the potential for legal challenges to oil deals in the future is another key risk. So to wrap up, in our view, politically, we have more on the horizon. Probably we will see Maduro finish term, but certainly we will continue to see Chavismo over the next couple of years becoming more radicalized. However, that said, there are very good opportunities, and I can tell you that a number of my clients on the ground are actually quite excited, despite the headline risks might be, when you actually see the opportunities that you're seeing on the ground right now, when you are seeing a government and a PDVSA that seem to be so flexible versus what you've seen over the last 18 years. That means, again, tolerance for risk for those that want to go in there, and making sure you do your homework as far as who you're dealing with, who you're doing business with, and what are the threats and potential adversaries you have underground while operating in Venezuela. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to also do a little bit of a shameless plug right here. So if you're interested in taking, certainly take a look at the book. It should be instructional in getting a sense of why we are where we are right now and what Venezuela should do to get out of it. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jeremy. If you have any questions,
No,
I'm
thank you.
happy to answer them.
Thank you, Raul. Superbly reported, a timely, important book. Congratulations. No, definitely. No such thing as shameless promotion. Just a reminder for everyone, we'll be using the chat function for the question and answer session. So as you see a question, there we go. So use that function for your questions. But hey, Raul, I'd like to, listening to you, I kept thinking about the famous admonition of high risk, high reward. But the high risk part is very clear. I'm still a little dubious on the high reward part. Maybe we can get into that a little bit on the question and answer session. Let me start with the question. I'd like you to do a little bit of a comparative analysis to sort of set the table for the discussion here. You were there, if I'm not mistaken, in Caracas as a reporter from 2004 until 2009. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
So here's the question. You talked a lot about the politicization of PDVSA and the intersection of the oil sector with politics in Venezuela, which is something I think everyone readily understands it and is very clear on. My question is, that also seems like something that we've all been seeing in working with for the better part of 10 to 15 years. So how different of that nature of politicization of PDVSA from your time there, 8, 9 years ago until today?
I would say you still have a very much politicized PDVSA. I would argue it depends on what we're looking at. I mean, the workers are much more politicized than back then. I mean, I remember there was an instance when the Minister Ramirez back then, there was a whole scandal because he actually appeared telling people, you are supposed to be, when you're supposed to support this government, and that's it. I would say that over the last few years, you're seeing that ethos has been instilled in PDVSA workers and PDVSA employees, and in many ways that remains, pretty much the mentality of a number of middle to low-level employees in PDVSA. I would even say higher level as well, but then you've also seen that during the Maduro administration, there have been changes to the PDVSA board. And in some of those changes, I would say there's more than just politicization, but also the issue that, Maduro has to keep different constituencies happy within Chavismo to ensure that he remains in power, and that means giving positions of power to different groups within Chavismo that would otherwise say not support him, and also give a role to some members of the military within the border. That said, since Chavismo came to power, I would say from Ramirez onward, still they do recognize the need to have someone in there that understands the business running things. Ramirez was head of PDVSA and oil minister. It was Del Pino that was actually keeping the trains running. This time around, Del Pino's still an operator, but he's had to adopt again a more political role, if you will. So I would say the politicization of Venezuela is absolute. I mean, it's very much a company run for the maintenance of Chavismo in power. But in order to maintain Chavismo in power, you still need to pump oil. That I think there's a recognition of that, especially now that oil prices are low. So in that, that's where I see the opportunity, and we can talk certainly about the payoff, a little bit more later.
There's a couple questions coming in, but I want to grab something you just said and turn to that briefly before we get to these very specific questions. I think what you were reiterating there was the whole concept of this pivot to more flexibility and pragmatism, which is something we've definitely been hearing. I mean, coincidental to the low oil price and the persistently low oil price. But my question is, has that apparent pivot to pragmatism actually resulted in real investment, real deals, and actual, opportunities to recover this production that you showed pretty much dropping off the cliff?
Oh no, I would say yes, you've had opportunities of real investment. I mean, you've had players like Chevron and many other players that have structured these trust fund agreements with the government in order to increase investment. And when you talk to some of these players on the ground, they're quite excited about that now. Players not imposing on them who to hire or how to buy I don't know, a car type or a truck or what have you, but that now you're having much more flexibility. Mind you, you could argue, well, relatively, that's still pretty a low bar, if you will. But still, this is a long-term business, and the opportunity that some of these guys have had to increase investment and increase production in some instances, particularly in the Faja, is not to be sneezed at. I mean, you still have situations where pumping oil is profitable, and some of these companies are there to make profit. I mean, that's it's a profit business. So in that sense, I would say you have a country where the cost per barrel is still around anywhere, depending on how you measure it, between 23 and 27 dollars a barrel. So you're still making money, and if oil prices keep creeping up, that only improves. So yes, I mean, you still have opportunities there, and that's actually getting materialized.
So there's a question here I think that will allow us to, speaking of pivoting, pivot to the geopolitical side of this. And obviously, I mentioned at the outset the sort of how Venezuela has sort of punched above its sort of size and in weight due to its oil largesse, whether it be creating OPEC or more recently in this hemisphere exerting a role in basically discounted oil, the Petrocaribe program, as well as shipments to Cuba. So the question is exactly that. Could you talk a little bit about, shed a little bit of light on where things stand with Petrocaribe, the Cuba shipments? Are they ongoing? What are the levels? What's happened on that side of the ledger in terms of Venezuela's oil largesse, let's call it?
Yes, no, sure. My understanding, and in that regard, I think we share a similar outlook in what we've seen just widely reported, and that is that Venezuela has reduced, the generosity, if you will, including with Cuba. They still continue to help Cuba. Obviously, Cuba sold them a franchise of how to remain in power. I advise you and help you stay in power, and you give me oil and hire a bunch of my doctors. That is still ongoing to some extent. You know, it's that was the deal with Chavismo, and Chavismo proved an apt pupil. I mean, both Maduro and Chavez were very savvy in learning the lessons of the Castro brothers, and in that sense, my understanding is particularly with Cuba, you are still some level of generosity, but obviously, you know, there's a limit to what you can do with a number of other partners. I wouldn't be able to actually give you specific figures, although it wouldn't be that hard for me to find any additional info if some of you want to reach out and certainly help. Sometimes I get interesting transparency through some sources, but yes, it's not what it used to be, obviously, in a few years ago. But you know, it's still very much what this government does. You know, keeping alliances neighboring countries for what that might mean internationally.
Maybe this isn't readily apparent, but I mean, are they still having? At one point, there were annual Petro-Caribe summits where all the members and partners would come together, and there would be a big, sessions and discussions. I mean, are those kinds of things still happening on an annual basis? I must admit, I haven't really
want to
seen.
say that last year there was a Petro-Caribe meeting, because I think there are different levels of Petro-Caribe meetings. There are annual ones, and others that are held without much fanfare. But my understanding was that there was a ministerial council of some form with Petro-Caribe ministers about a year ago that I know of. But yes, I mean, I would say, you know, obviously the ongoing job of Chavismo to make sure they reach out to potential international political partners is ongoing. In Petro-Caribe, it's not something that has been completely scrapped, I can tell you that.
Yeah. So questions that pertain to a couple of, in terms of, I guess, the overall operation and maintenance. The first question has to do on the refining side. I don't know if you can read it as well, but the question says that they hear that there's a low utilization rate of the refining system, around 30%, due to constant outages and accidents. And then they referenced the Umawe refinery accident several years ago. Talk a little bit about the operation and maintenance, the utilization, the system, the potential for real, accidents and damage, et cetera, in general terms, but then also specifically.
Yeah, I would say that 30% sounds a bit low. The last I heard was around 40. But again, obviously, as you know, the level of transparency we get from PDVSA and the government is quite limited, to say the least. The issue with Venezuela and with the upkeep of refining has been an issue of level cash, and PDVSA has priorities that are spending above, reinvesting not only in oil production but in the upkeep of refinery installations, and that combined with again the politicization of the sector. You have a number of there is a tendency within PDVSA to hire people for their political connection. You might have an individual all of a sudden show up at a drilling crew because he was sent from a high up guy in PDVSA in Caracas, and people look around and they're like, yeah, well, sure, yeah, join in. Do you have any experience? Well, not really. Well, yes. That type of approach is an approach that has happened across the oil sector, and we've seen the results. I mean, we've seen high levels of accidents over the years. We've seen, obviously, if I'm not mistaken, it was in 2013 where we had the big explosion in the Paraguaná complex. So this is an issue, although we haven't seen something as big since then, it's still certainly an issue that the sector struggles with, and the companies struggle with whenever dealing with PDVSA. And that it's an issue. most of the private sector companies complain about. That you have a lack of, a lot of people have left for other countries, and you have still a lot of people that are in the business just because, you know, they're friends with whomever within China that allow them to get a job in a.
So then there's the follow-on question was then pertaining to, I mean, I think some of the answers translate over to the upstream as well, but talk just briefly, if you could, about what's going on there. I mean, you did talk about some of the new opportunities have been created, so maybe it's not as extreme on the upstream side in terms of the O&M, but talk a little bit about the upstream side of this equation.
Yeah, no, I would say, you know, in the upstream side, we see similar issues. In some cases, you know, there has been improvement over the last couple of years just because, as I mentioned, some of the players on the ground have finally gotten some more freedom to actually hire certain people. That said, however, I would say one of the biggest concerns of the upstream side is again, you know, there's a whole generation of, you know, oil specialized, you know, oil workers or you know, even managers that have left, and so there's a huge gap, and Venezuela hasn't been able over the last, say, 18 years to educate this new generation of people to actually know what they're doing on the ground, and so that's certainly an issue, but yes, you have, you know, drilling crews take twice as long to do a job, you know, in Venezuela than they would in other circumstances, partly because sometimes you have an issue of inexperience, and you have an issue of also politicization. I mean, in some projects for many, many years, PDVSA used to use as a benchmark for, you know, appropriate work, what do you say, desempeño, sorry, the word escapes me right now, but you know, how a worker does his job, one of the things that they would measure is their allegiance to the cause. You know, how many times you went to political meetings. In many cases, you have PDVSA being still the majority owner of these projects. You know, they will bust out a bunch of workers and leave a certain crew whenever it's you have an electoral cycle, so they can go and, you know, applaud and do what they're supposed to do. So, you know, these are issues that add up. And so on top of that, you have where, you know, how do you get replacement for something as a car tire or a car battery can take a very long time, because there is still in many cases, especially, you know, over the last year that has improved, but, you know, you still have having to approve in every project, you know, the purchase of you know, a few batteries for different cars or what have you, and that took a very long process. And when you have runaway inflation, if you look for you know, a particular valuation for a purchase you want to make, that obviously goes away in like 15 days, and that pricing no longer makes sense. So you have to start the whole process again to require approval for a purchase of a piece of equipment or whatever. So all of these things, obviously, you can imagine how hard it can be to actually get work done, and I think that is one of the major concerns when it comes to the upstream. And on top of that, and I think I mentioned that in the presentation, is the issue of runaway crime. I mean, in most projects now in the Faja, you have the military presence there, and that hasn't been there for more than a few months. But what you had is individuals blocking access of engineers to specific projects and saying, "We want jobs," quote unquote. They would hand you over a phone, and it turns out that there's some, you know, big, you know, crime syndicate capo calling you saying, you know, you either give us money or quote unquote jobs, or, you know, you're gonna get into trouble. You have individuals stealing power generators, stealing all kinds of parts so they can resell them as scrap metal. This is an ongoing, messy situation. That is what you face in the upstream every day.
Yeah. And so therefore, of course, it translates into, you mentioned all the cost overruns and all the difficulties, but also translates into probably inadequate maintenance and operation. So
Yeah,
let's.
but even then, I mean, if you look at the fact that in some of these projects you have costs of between 20 or less a barrel. If the government in some cases allows these companies to exchange dollars at a much more favorable exchange rate, those costs go way down. So if you're there, if you're operating, and if you have a certain freedom to actually pump oil out of the ground at an acceptable rate, you're still making money even with all those inefficiencies. That's the fascinating thing about this in Venezuela.
High risk, high reward. I guess it's true. We're running out of time. I want to give folks, if there's any other final questions from folks out there online. I've got a very specific question. It's almost more of a curiosity. You had a chart of the oil production showing the decline. I'm curious, how easy, or how do you get the numbers? How do you get the production numbers? I mean, I'm guessing ever since PDVSA stopped doing SEC reports, I imagine it's very difficult to get actual production, realistic, verifiable production figures. Is that a fair statement?
No, in that sense, yeah, no, absolutely, and thank you for the question. I think there's no magic here, and I think most of the people need it. A lot of us keep an eye on the monthly reports by OPEC, and there are secondary. There are data based on secondary sources, and there's data based on direct communication with the government. I mean, to absolutely fair, what I do is I just take Venezuela's, the direct communication numbers and give them the benefit of the doubt and use those. And I think a lot of people do that for sake of, I wouldn't say fairness, but just for the sake of saying, yeah, sure, okay, I'll take your word for it. Let's work with what you're telling me, and it's still quite dire. I mean, if you look at those figures over the last year, you're still going to see quite a drop. So, in that sense, a lot of people feel that that's as good as it gets at this point in time. But yes, I tend to use the direct communication numbers that OPEC puts out.
Okay. I want to wrap up with something that for years has been a huge part of any discussion on oil in Venezuela, and it comes back to what you kept flagging as one of the critical challenges, and that's financing. Very curious that I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I heard the word China at all during your formal presentation. Right. So let's maybe wrap up here. I know it's probably not the best way to wrap up, but I'm very curious to hear where are things today. We all are aware of the, literally billions of dollars of Chinese financing that's flowed to Venezuela, secured by oil. How much of that production is basically automatically going to China to securitize all the debt? And is there more Chinese loans coming in? Walk us through, in as much as you can, where we are on the China-Venezuela financing question.
Yeah, sure. No, China certainly continues to be a pillar of Venezuela's finances. I think that's pretty clear, and it has taken the form of these joint funds that Venezuela has set up with the Chinese government, where Venezuela gets financing to essentially spend the money. It ends up spending the money once, and in exchange, Venezuela pays in oil. I'm gonna have to get back to you on the exact percentage, although I know it's become a more and more important relationship. But certainly it's not just China. And in our view, certainly China has shown an indication to continue to help the government financially. And it seems that even though there were doubts last year, some of our analysts and consultants we're hearing noises that their patience was coming to an end. Still, we saw late last year that China turned around and was still helping out, if you will. So I think that relationship will continue, but it's something that we're monitoring far more closely. Say that we're monitoring potential for default. It's one of those things that you keep an eye on and just look at 6-month increments. Things can change so quickly. That said, the other piece of the puzzle here is Russia, of course. And in the case of Russia, we've seen a direct, as opposed to pay me in oil, it's, I want actual stakes. Give me participation in this project, or give me participation in another. Let's sign this deal. It seems as though they're more focused on, sure, I'll help you out, but I want actual assets that can help me have a a foothold in the actual oil production, in the actual oil sector. So China's also participating, but the big headline with China has always been, I'll give you cash, and mostly been, I'll give you cash and you give me barrels.
Right.
But again, these are two big partners, and in our view, this level of flexibility that we're seeing right now is likely to benefit first, state oil companies, players that are somehow related to governments that are friendly to Chavismo. That's not to say that you won't have private players benefit. I think we've all seen big players in Venezuela that continue to operate there, and if the government perceives you as a friendly company in a moment of need, it wouldn't be surprising that the government starts offering these type of opportunities to private players.
It's like everything basically with Venezuela right now. It's complex. It's a lot of head fakes, and it could change quickly, I guess. It's without putting words in your mouth. But well, Raul, look, we're out of time. We could go on for a while. I really appreciate your participation here in our energy webinar series, and honestly, helping us try and navigate the haze that is the current and future outlook for Venezuela, and particularly its oil sector. Thank you so much for your insights, and congratulations on publishing the book. I know you've been working on that for a long time, so congratulations. I want to quickly just point to folks. We obviously have the webinar series, and stay tuned. Our next webinar will be April 20th. We'll get some information out on that soon. But our in-person and our regional events will be in Argentina on March 30th to talk about the intersection of energy and the economy in Argentina. Just hope you can join us there. We'll be doing a workshop here on April 4th, focused specifically on geothermal, and then of course the annual La Jolla conference, May 24th and 25th. And Raul, was it last year, I think you were here, or the year before? I forget now. For the La Jolla
I was
conference.
there in 2015.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, you'll have to come back this year.
Sure, more than happy.
Excellent. We look forward to seeing everyone. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Raul Gallegos, and have a wonderful rest of your Friday. Hey, happy St. Patrick's Day. And I hope everyone's wearing green in honor of our Irish brethren. So thanks so much. Stay tuned for the April 20th webinar. We'll be getting that information out to people shortly. Thanks again for your participation. Have a great day.
Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate it. Have a good one. Bye, everyone.